Critical thinking has been getting a lot of press in our educational system today. Critical thinking is a way of deciding whether a claim is always true, sometimes true, partly true, or false. It helps us determine the difference between truth and fiction. Critical thinking can be thought of as a vital skill as it prevents people from making bad decisions and helps them to solve problems. Today we'll focus on why we need to think critically, California's critical thinking requirement, what critical thinking involves, and then finally, the critical attitude or the critical standpoint. Why do we need to think critically? Well, everyone thinks, but not everyone thinks well. Our thoughts are often biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, and occasionally prejudicial. But the decisions that we make from our thought often follow us for the rest of our lives. That means that uncritical thoughts will lead to poor decisions. Way back in 1941, Edward Glaser proposed that the ability to think critically involves three elements: an attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subjects that come within the range of one's experiences, knowledge of the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning, and then some skill in applying those methods. So it's not enough to just have the knowledge, you have to be able to have the skills as well. Recognizing this, the state of California enacted a requirement for critical thinking, starting in elementary schools and continuing up into the university system. California's critical thinking requirement is designed to achieve an understanding of the relationship of language to logic, which would lead to the ability to analyze, criticize, and advocate ideas, reason inductively and deductively, and reach factual or judgmental conclusions based upon sound references drawn from unambiguous statements of knowledge or belief. Notice that this involves both receptive, the analyze, criticize ideas, reasoning inductively and deductively, and drawing conclusions, as well as expressive skills, because you are not just the receiver of messages, you often need to advocate those messages. So you need to be a critical thinker in your process of designing your case to advocate. This critical thinking requirement is codified in the CSUs, or the California State University graduation requirements. Sac State, for example, spells it out under their general education objectives when they identify student outcomes as being able to construct a non-fallacious verbal argument, recognize fallacious arguments, and follow the verbal arguments of others. Related, students are expected to be able to find and use common information resources, engaging in specialized library research, and using computers to seek out appropriate expert opinion and advice. Community college students planning to transfer to a CSU must meet the critical thinking requirement, usually met by a fairly high-level English composition course or argumentation courses. Similar expectations are found for IGETC, which is the Intersegmental General Education Transfer Curriculum. What is considered to constitute minimum competence in critical thinking? Well, first you have to be able to distinguish fact from judgment and belief from knowledge. You also need to be able to demonstrate your skills in inductive and deductive processes, including an understanding of the formal and informal fallacies of language and thought. Note the prominent role of understanding fallacies. Much of the instruction of critical thinking involves the ability to identify fallacies. You can think of critical thinking as a process in which a person tries to answer rationally those questions that cannot be easily answered and for which all the relevant information is not available. It involves the ability to explore a problem, question, or situation. That means you have to recognize problems to find a workable means for meeting those problems. Understand the importance of prioritization and the order of precedence in problem solving. Also, critical thinking means you need to collect and understand pertinent or relevant information, meaning that you must be able to recognize those assumptions and values that are not only stated but unstated, as well as comprehend and use appropriate language. And you do this so that you can come to a conclusion, which means that you must be able to interpret data to appraise evidence, determine whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, true or false, as well as evaluate arguments. You'll need to recognize logical relationships between claims so that you can arrive at accurate judgments about specific things and qualities in your everyday life. And you'll need to be able to justify your position. In the case of critical thinking, the word critical shouldn't be thought of as synonymous with negative. Instead, think of critical as relating to the word critique or criticism. When you are critiquing or criticizing, you're not looking for ways to attack the information or the source. Instead, you are carefully examining the information and then drawing well-considered conclusions or judgments about that information. So at the end of the critical thinking process, you will determine whether you should accept or reject the claims. When asked what is wrong with the world and what should we do about it, spiritual leader the Dalai Lama replied, critical thinking followed by action. Meaning we must analyze the problems and then think very carefully about the conclusions we've drawn from our analysis. That's the critical thinking process. Once we have engaged in the critical thinking process, we then must take the appropriate actions that are based upon those conclusions. Critical thinking skills can be subdivided into two different types. Skills of discovery involve receptive skills. It involves evaluating evidence, arguments, understanding the relevance and judging the relevance of evidence and reasoning, and then understand how inferences work. Skills of justification are much more expressive. They're generally used in defending positions. Now, the word defending may throw you off. It means as well that when you are advocating a position, you will end up having to defend it. So that means that you will be selecting the best evidence to support your position, choosing the best solution from many alternative solutions available to you, anticipating and countering objections to your view, which would definitely be defending positions, as well as employing sound reasoning. Ronald and Karen Lee of Indiana University, Bloomington, suggest that we develop a critical attitude. And in their words, we would then have a critical standpoint with the following attitudes. You must be intellectually curious, which means you should seek answers to various kinds of questions and problems. You should be challenging easy explanations. You also need to be open-minded and flexible. Be willing to consider alternative points of view. Being willing to consider does not necessarily mean that you are committed to accept those views, but you should explore them and better understand them. Another attitude of the critical standpoint is being systematic. That means that you're committed to following a line of reasoning to its conclusion. You may have to use a particular structure. Think about, for example, when you pack for a trip. You could just throw things into a suitcase willy-nilly, or you could develop a system so that you are less likely to overlook something. There are a variety of systems you could develop, but by imposing a structure to the task, you tend to be more efficient and effective. You'll want to be decisive, but also be persistent. These two concepts of persistence and decisiveness represent opposite sides of the same coin. Now, while you must make decisions based upon the available evidence, you often have very limited evidence available. This means that once you make that decision, you shouldn't end the critical thinking process. You should continue or persist in your investigation of the issue. And related to being open-minded and flexible, you should demonstrate respect for other viewpoints. This recognizes that several different and often competing viewpoints are deserving of respect. You can respect others' viewpoints, but not accept them as your own. Processing time. How important is it that our citizenry develop critical thinking skills? What part of the critical thinking skills do you think are the most important? And what are the two types of critical thinking skills? Hopefully you will approach learning, refining, and using your critical thinking skills with a healthy attitude of respect. As a result of critical thinking, you should be making more informed and better decisions.